Terrorists have struck two major energy production facilities in Saudi Arabia with varied success.
This just in, we are receiving reports of massive explosions at a natural gas processing plant in Harad, Saudi Arabia.
And although the amount of additional oil removed from the world market is relatively small, the real threat is what the attacks signal about the stability of the Saudi regime.
If the Saudis aren't able to play the swing producers as they've actually done for the last decades, volatility could increase, and increase when you're talking about prices in the $120 range can have severe implications.
There's no way to make Saudi Arabia safe from the potential for instability. So the challenge then for policymakers such as ourselves is to figure out a way that we can make the U.S. and the world relatively safe from instability in Saudi Arabia.
Then the crisis moves closer to home.
I just got a report from my deputy regarding an apparent terrorist attack on the port of Valdez, Alaska. An oil tanker that was entering the port has rammed another tanker that was just about to leave.
Multiple attacks on two continents. Certainly sounds like Al-Qaeda. It does remind me of the video of bin Laden where he talked about attacking the American economy.
With the price of oil rising rapidly, the panel begins to quantify the potentially severe consequences for the U.S. economy.
I've just been informed that the price of crude is now $123 a barrel, and gas at the pump is $4.74. That's for 87 octane.
We're going to lose the airlines, may lose the autos, may lose PBGC, Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation.
I think we are at one of these places we do not know the answers.
The problem is that we are at war with a fanatic enemy that has lots of patience and wants to destroy not only our infrastructure, but us.
The vulnerability of an interdependent global oil infrastructure becomes clear.
We're clearly as vulnerable now to domestic disasters as we are to interruptions in foreign supply, that the infrastructure is too big to protect as a whole. You might protect a few nodes and some specific pieces of it, but you can't protect the entire infrastructure.
The Cabinet Working Group confronts the reality that once an oil supply disruption occurs, there are limited short-term options to protect the U.S. economy.
We don't want to do harm. I remember the '79 crisis where we did have long gas lines. Congress enacted a lot of things, a lot of which, in my opinion, were fatally flawed. And Congress spent the next several years repealing them.
It only requires a relatively small amount of oil to be taken out of the system to have huge economic and security implications, and I think that's the message.
With America's vulnerability now apparent, terrorists wait only 5 months to seize the opportunity to inflict further damage.
But officials believe that more than 120 Americans have been killed and another 100 were wounded in a sudden eruption of violence that included attacks in at least 16 locations around the country.
A wave of violence in Saudi Arabia forces the evacuation of many foreign nationals.
250 wounded in the two-day terror
With critical oil expertise now departing the country, analysts believe Saudi Arabia will be unable to build spare capacity or meet future oil demand growth. Put another way, the oil-dependent economies have lost their producer of last resort. The panel quickly concludes that bold, long-term measures are required.
If you've waited until the crisis is upon you, as we have in this instance, the real problem is year 2 through 5. How do you impose that kind of daily pain on Americans for a 3 or 4 year period before the alternatives can begin to be felt?
What are some long-term commitments we can make, some changes in policy, some changes in our tax codes and requirements that will really put us on a different track?
I have worked in Washington for 6 presidents over the last 40 years. And I would tell you that in my perception, other than the Cold War, long-range planning in the American government tends to be about a week from today. As we look at the consequences of $120 oil or more a barrel and gasoline at $5 a gallon, that the American people are going to pay a terrible price, at least in the short term, for not having had a strategy.
The simulation concludes with oil at a price of $161 per barrel and gas in the U.S. at $5.74 per gallon. Based on the projections of the scenario, an approximately 4% shortfall in global daily supply results in a 177% increase in the price of oil. An economic analysis predicts millions of lost U.S. jobs and a drop in the S&P 500 of more than 25%. The impact on the economies of Europe and Asia could be even more dramatic. Oil Shockwave was designed by leading experts in oil production, energy markets, and national security to force some of the nation's most experienced decision makers to confront an oil supply crisis. The overall lesson is clear. To avoid the devastating impact of a supply interruption, the United States must undertake a long-term commitment to reducing the nation's oil dependence. Achieving the goals of reducing demand and expanding supply will require strong leadership to forge a coherent and effective oil security policy. Oil Shockwave, an oil crisis executive simulation, a project of Securing America's Future Energy and the National Commission on Energy Policy.